Hello, I'm Darcy Chapoul with the Texas Department of Transportation.
And I'm Tina Geiselbruck with the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. We'd like to welcome you to the virtual workshop for the development of the 2023 to 2026 Rural Transportation Improvement Program. The Texas Department of Transportation, in partnership with the Alamo Regional Rural Planning Organization, ARPO, is conducting workshops in each of the rural counties of the TxDOT San Antonio District. TxDOT is also providing this virtual option for those unable to attend in person. The same materials shown at the workshops are available online. Additionally, online engagement software allows you to submit comments, suggestions, and concerns directly to TxDOT. This presentation will present information about rural transportation planning and funding. TxDOT wants your feedback on the draft 2023 to 2026 Rural Transportation Improvement Program. After watching this presentation, we encourage you to review the other workshop materials and offer your comments via the interactive software. You can also comment via mail or email. All comments must be postmarked or received by April 7th, 2022.
Okay, let's start with some basics. What is a Rural Planning Organization, or RPO, and what do they do? Contrary to what you might think, an RPO is more than a football term. Rural planning organizations represent rural and small urban areas that are outside the boundaries of a metropolitan planning area. A metropolitan planning organization, or MPO, conducts planning for the areas inside the metropolitan planning area. These boundaries are created based on population and population growth. The Texas Administrative Code recognizes the authority of RPOs, but they are voluntary organizations that are created and governed by elected officials. TxDOT and RPOs work cooperatively on transportation planning and programming. The RPO provides recommendations and priorities to TxDOT, and TxDOT approves the projects. The projects get included in TxDOT's planning documents, which we'll cover shortly. In the San Antonio area, the MPO covers Bexar, Comal, and Guadalupe counties and a small portion of Kendall County. The area shaded in darker yellow is the boundary of the Alamo area MPO. The counties shaded in lighter yellow are the counties included in the Alamo Regional Rural Planning Organization, including the parts of Kendall County not covered by the MPO. Uvalde County, in green, is not part of the RPO, but is part of the TxDOT San Antonio District. There are several factors that guide the transportation planning process. Key factors include system conditions, population growth, the Texas economy, freight movement, trade technology, safety, and risk and resiliency. To read up on these items, you can find this handout under the Download section of the meeting page at txdot.gov.
Now that we know a little about RPOs, let's learn a little bit more about the TxDOT transportation planning process. TxDOT's planning documents outline goals and strategies that guide transportation planning. The Texas Transportation Plan 2050 is the primary mechanism that TxDOT uses to evaluate its long-term investment priorities, and it drives the department's planning and project selection activities. It is a statewide multimodal transportation plan that is updated every 4 years. The TxDOT Strategic Plan for 2019 to 2023 was adopted by the Transportation Commission in June 2018 and includes action plans to address TxDOT's 7 strategic goals. The strategic plan is updated every 2 years. These documents guide how the department carries out transportation planning and programming. TxDOT's plans are further developed into a series of programs. These programs are documented in TxDOT's planning products, including the Unified Transportation Program, or the UTP, the Statewide Transportation Improvement Program, the STIP, and the letting schedule. The UTP is a 10-year plan that identifies a pipeline of projects to achieve the department's performance goals. The STIP is a list of projects that have identified funding and are in the final stages of development. The STIP is a compilation of projects from metro and rural areas. Finally, the letting schedule authorizes and administers funding for projects to be constructed in the next 2 years.
The rural TIP is part of the STIP and includes a list of local projects to be funded and underway in TxDOT's district over the next 4 years following approval. These are the projects you can expect to go to contract in the near future. It is multimodal, which means that it can include projects related to highways, bicycle and pedestrian facilities, transit services, and freight projects, as well as the preliminary studies used to define those projects. Projects included in the rural TIP indicate there is a regional agreement on the need and priority of the transportation project. Because the program rules are established by federal law, no project can receive federal funding unless it is listed in the rural TIP. These county workshops and this virtual workshop experience is your opportunity to provide input as the rural TIP is developed. Now, let me give you some facts about rural transportation in Texas. There are nearly 57,000 miles of roadways and almost 25,000 bridges that are outside of the metro areas. That includes nearly 10,500 miles on the Texas trunk system and 50,000 miles of farm ranch to market roads. And 53% of the Texas freight network is located in rural areas. These systems are vital to the Texas economy, and most of the funding to build and maintain these systems is based on a formula. For example, preventative maintenance and rehabilitation funding are distributed based on pavement distress scores, on-system lane miles, truck traffic volumes, and on-system bridge deck area. Similar formula-based approaches are used to determine funding for bridges and safety. Bicycle and pedestrian projects are mostly funded through the TxDOT-administered Transportation Alternatives Program. Rural airports are funded in part through the Federal Aviation Administration grants, and rural public transit is funded through Federal Transit Administration grants. In addition, TxDOT has allocated $2.1 billion to the Energy Sector Program for fiscal year 2020 to 2029 to address specifically identified roadways affected by traffic in various energy development areas. For the San Antonio district, that would be Eagle Ford Shale area.
Some more facts that are relevant to rural transportation include the fact that 15% of Texas residents live in a rural area. TxDOT has a planned investment of $4,700 per rural resident. That's 33% higher than the statewide average. TxDOT's Project Tracker, which keeps track of all TxDOT projects, includes more than 6,400 projects in rural areas, totaling almost $23 billion in project cost. We'll talk more specifically about the types of funding in just a minute.
Before we get to specifics about funding categories, it's also important to mention the recently signed Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This act provides for a substantial infusion of federal monies for infrastructure projects over the next 5 years. Much of this funding is determined by formula, as we discussed earlier. I should mention that these are anticipated amounts as determined by TxDOT administration. This graphic shows the total that is expected to be apportioned to Texas over the next 5 fiscal years. You can see that beginning in fiscal year 22, it is almost $1 billion more than fiscal year 21. This will provide TxDOT and its partners with considerable opportunity to positively impact transportation in Texas.
Now let's talk about the most common categories for funding rural projects. Preventative maintenance and rehabilitation includes projects such as overlays and seal coats. The statewide connectivity category funds projects that connect people and places. This might be creating a connection between a state highway and an interstate. The Structures Replacement and Rehabilitation Bridge Program and the Railroad Grade Separation Program are pretty much as they sound. This provides funding for bridge replacements and to separate roads from railways. Funding for safety projects includes many programs such as the Federal Highway Improvement Program, the Federal Railway Highway Crossing Program, and the Safety Bond Program. Transportation alternatives and transportation enhancements fund projects such as bike lanes, safe routes to school, and sidewalk connectivity. Finally, the district has a source of funds to use at the discretion of the district engineer. It is important to note that some projects may be eligible for funding from several categories. This can be helpful in the case of an especially large project.
We've talked about planning and planning products and funding categories. So as a quick recap, we are interested in your input about the draft Rural TIP and future priorities in your county. The Rural TIP is a program of projects over the next 4 years, and when approved, the Rural TIP becomes part of the statewide TIP, along with plans for metropolitan areas. That doesn't mean that you can't suggest projects that will be necessary farther into the future. This exercise is about identifying priorities and matching projects with funding.
Unfortunately, even with the infusion of funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, project needs nearly always exceed available funding. That's why it's important to have these workshops and to identify and get agreement on priorities. The district has challenges that they will need to consider as well, including conflicting objectives and trade-offs between modes and projects. It's also often necessary to work cooperatively with cities in the county and with leadership in an adjacent county. Longer-term projects need sustained interest and support. These challenges are important to keep in mind when planning future projects. The more agreement there is on a project, the greater the likelihood for success.
We've provided you some background information about rural transportation planning in Texas. Now we invite you to review the materials associated with each county. The materials include information about population and anticipated population growth in the Alamo Regional Rural Planning Organization. They also include maps that show daily traffic counts, number of lanes and lane widths, crashes, and TxDOT funded projects from 2016 to 2026. Keep this information in mind, as well as TxDOT's plans and priorities, as you identify needs and priorities in the interactive software. The interactive software allows users to provide feedback and indicate where there are concerns or issues that should be addressed. You can scan the QR code on the screen or go to TxDOT.gov and search San Antonio RTIP in the search box in the top right-hand side. If you have any questions, please reach out to me at darcy.chapoul@txdot.gov or 210-615-5902. The deadline for comments is April 7th, 2022. We appreciate your time in watching this video, and we hope you have found it informative.